Tunes of Glory was not just Ronald Neame's most accomplished film. It was a production assembled from an Ealing Studios rejection, a paperback cover that offended a Scottish colonel, and a casting arrangement so contentious that the director had to be overruled by his own star before the film's most celebrated performance was permitted to happen, made on Shepperton soundstages by London soldiers who had to be taught to wear kilts, in Technicolor that critics found so distracting they complained about a man's mustache. We are digging into the wreckage of Tunes of Glory with 13 secrets the studio tried to bury, secrets locked inside out-of-print critical memoirs, the Kennaway Papers, Ann Coates's documented production testimony, the Criterion Collection's scholarly apparatus, and the specific institutional failure that kept the film invisible for 60 years, while Hitchcock called it one of the finest ever made. Before Colin Leslie produced Tunes of Glory, before Ronald Neame directed it, before Alec Guinness or John Mills were attached to it, the project had already been developed, assessed, and rejected at Ealing Studios, and the man responsible for the rejection was not an executive but a script reader, Kenneth Tynan, then in his mid-20s and working at Ealing between theater criticism assignments, who evaluated Kennaway's first draft adaptation of his own novel and wrote coverage characterizing it as containing too much army worship. That view, documented in the Criterion Collection's scholarly apparatus for the film, was shared by director Alexander McKendrick, whose own instinct for institutional critique, later expressed in Sweet Smell of Success, made him among the more credible judges of whether a script was genuinely examining its subject or merely celebrating it. The combination of Tynan's written objection and McKendrick's resistance effectively ended Ealing's interest in the project. By the time Kennaway rewrote the draft, Ealing itself had ceased to exist as a functioning independent studio, its financial decline having accelerated to the point where the institution that had sustained British film comedy for a decade could no longer mount the productions it had once made routinely. Jack Hawkins, who had been attached as Jock Sinclair during the Ealing development phase, was no longer available. The project that had been killed by a script reader's two-word objection was reborn in the hands of an independent producer who had nothing to lose and two stars who were willing to be cast against everything the audience expected of them. But the real problem was that the novel whose script had offended Ealing was drawn from something considerably more specific and considerably more uncomfortable than either Tynan or McKendrick had been willing to engage with directly. James Kennaway published Tunes of Glory in 1956 at the age of 28, having served his national service with the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders and subsequently with the 1st Battalion of the Gordon Highlanders on the Rhine in occupied Germany. He had liked the military, he had not liked his regiment. The specific discomfort he had experienced in the Gordon Highlanders, the disruptive rivalries, the class hierarchies, the competing claims of institutional loyalty and individual dignity had remained in him with the persistence of material that has not yet found its proper form. He had said, in a phrase preserved in a Goodreads annotation drawn from a reader's introduction to the Canongate Classics edition, that he would sooner serve with the Argentine police than accept a regular commission in the Gordons. The characters in the novel are based on officers he served with, translated into fictional composites with enough structural distance that libel was unlikely, but recognition was possible. The model for Campbell Barracks, the novel's claustrophobic military enclosure, was the Queen's Barracks in Perth, where Kennaway had served part of his national service and which he found adequately representative of everything he wanted to dissect about the peacetime military institution. That the production then found it impossible to film at any Scottish barracks and was compelled to reconstruct the entire environment on Shepperton soundstages was an irony. Kennaway observed from the set throughout principal photography, present as technical consultant, watching London soldiers be taught to wear kilts on a stage representing the institution he had fled. This is exactly why the film's claustrophobia is not a production limitation. It is the film's most precise formal statement. Ronald Neame approached the commanding officer of Stirling Castle, the regimental headquarters of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, in the expectation that a filmed celebration of a Highland regiment's traditions and loyalties would receive broad institutional cooperation. The commanding officer was initially receptive, then he saw the cover of Kennaway's novel in its paperback edition. The cover featured Mary Titterington, a model depicted in a state of undress that the paperback publisher had clearly calculated would move units at railway bookstalls, in a pose bearing no relationship whatsoever to the content of a novel about two middle-aged officers disputing command of a Scottish battalion. The commanding officer's response, documented in both the Cineast magazine critical assessment and the TCM production notes, was immediate and total, He would not permit the Argylls to be associated with a production drawn from material marketed in that fashion. The production was offered permission to photograph distant exteriors of the castle on the condition that a matte shot would make it unrecognizable in the finished film. Everything else, the barracks interiors, the officers' mess, the parade grounds, the regimental spaces that define the film's entire physical world, was built on Shepperton soundstages by production designer Wilfred Shingleton, from Kennaway's descriptions and from whatever photographic reference could be obtained through channels. The commanding officer had not specifically closed. The paperback cover that destroyed the location agreement had been designed to sell novels. It succeeded in that function while simultaneously ensuring that the film made from those novels would be set inside a constructed world rather than a real one. The construction turned out to be no disadvantage at all. The score for Tunes of Glory was composed by Malcolm Arnold, a fact whose significance in 1960 was impossible to separate from the context in which audiences received it. Arnold had composed the score for The Bridge on the River Kwai 3 years earlier, winning the Academy Award for it in 1958. His association with that film, and with David Lean's broader reputation for prestigious British military cinema, created an expectation around Tunes of Glory that its distributor actively exploited. The Criterion Collection's restoration materials document that the film's trailer pitched it explicitly as a successor to The Bridge on the River Kwai, a comparison that was commercially logical, critically distorting, and fundamentally dishonest about what the film was actually doing. The Bridge on the River Kwai is a film about British institutional endurance under external pressure. Tunes of Glory is a film about British institutions destroying themselves from within. The comparison invited audiences to bring expectations the film was designed to frustrate. Arnold's score, which uses original pipe music with the structural intelligence of a composer who understood that the bagpipes' cultural associations would do half his thematic work for him, was received in the context of the wrong film by audiences primed for a different argument. The trailer that exploited Arnold's association with Lean had, in effect, written a review of a film that did not exist and distributed it in advance of the film that did. But the real problem was that the marketing confusion was minor compared to the casting confusion that had almost prevented the film's central performance from happening at all. Alec Guinness had been offered the role of Barrow, the disciplinarian colonel, the institutional authority figure, the role that most obviously rhymed with his Colonel Nicholson in The Bridge on the River Kwai. He found the character too familiar, too close to work he had recently and definitively done, and communicated clearly that what interested him was Jock Sinclair, the up-from-the-ranks whiskey drinker, the regimental institution held together by force of personality rather than institutional standing. Director Ronald Neame, who had already worked with Guinness twice, and who knew his capabilities precisely, found the proposed casting implausible. The Guinness he knew was cerebral, controlled, precise, not the physical, volatile, emotionally exposed figure that Sinclair required. Anne Coates, who edited the film, and whose account of the production is documented in a published interview with Flickering Myth, describes what happened next with the directness of someone who had watched the entire negotiation from a professional position of trust. Guinness agreed to do a screen test. Neame remained unconvinced. They shot the test. Neame watched it, and, as Coates put it, they decided to take a chance on him. The test that persuaded Neame is not publicly available. What it produced, Guinness's transformation into a red-haired, whiskey-flushed, physically present figure who Neame later called one of the most complex performances he had ever been responsible for, is visible in every frame of the finished film. The director, who had been reluctant to schedule the test, supervised the making of the performance it enabled. This is exactly why the film's most celebrated achievement was, at its origin, a performance that nearly wasn't permitted to happen. The decision to shoot Tunes of Glory in Technicolor was, in the context of British filmmaking in 1960, actively unusual. The British new wave that surrounded the film was producing its most celebrated work in black and white, and the monochrome image had become so thoroughly associated with serious British cinema of the period that color carried specific generic connotations. Westerns were in color, epics were in color, intimate, class-conscious character studies were in black and white. Arthur Ibbotsson's cinematography for Tunes of Glory was, as the Criterion Collection's scholarly essay by Robert Murphy identifies, unusual at a time when black and white was so much the British norm that a critic complained about Guinness's distracting marmalade mustache. That a critic's substantive objection to a film about institutional power, class conflict, and psychological disintegration was Alec Guinness's facial hair, made visible by a color format the critic found inappropriate to the subject matter, is not merely an amusing footnote. It is a precise measure of how thoroughly the film's formal choices disrupted the available frameworks for receiving it. The mustache was red, the film was in color, These were not problems with the film. They were the film insisting that it did not belong to the tradition it was being assessed against. The practical consequence of the Stirling Castle refusal was not merely the loss of exterior locations, it extended to the film's entire military population. With no cooperation from actual Scottish Highland regiments, the production was compelled to recruit its uniformed extras from London, soldiers who were available, professionally disciplined, technically competent at the drill sequences the film required, and entirely unfamiliar with the specific protocols of Highland regimental dress. The kilts presented a specific operational problem. As the cineaste critical assessment documents with the specificity of a production note rather than a film review, London soldiers were skilled at bagpipes, but requiring instruction in the fine art of wearing kilts. The film that presents an apparently seamless visual world of Highland military tradition, complete with authentic dress and authentic bearing, was populated by Englishmen who had to be taught, in the days before shooting, how to wear the uniform that the regiment's actual members would have worn since adolescence. Kennaway, present on set throughout principal photography as Neame's technical consultant, watched this instruction with the particular quality of attention available to a man who had actually worn the uniform, who had found it both a burden and a badge, and who had written a novel about the specific psychological damage that a lifetime inside its protocols could produce. Among the biographical footnotes that the film's marketing materials did not include was the specific context of the relationship between James Kennaway and his wife Susan, whose turbulent partnership was documented in the Kennaway Papers, a volume that Susan published after her husband's death in 1981 and which contains, among its revelations, an account of her affair with John Le Carre. Le Carre, whose own novels about institutional loyalty and personal betrayal constitute one of the more sustained bodies of work in post-war British fiction, conducted a relationship with the wife of a man whose first novel is also about institutional loyalty and personal betrayal. The Kennaway Papers, which illuminate the specific emotional landscape from which Tunes of Glory was drawn, Kennaway's charm, volatility, hard drinking, and intense personality, were available to critics and scholars for decades before anyone connected the biographical triangle to the film's central argument that the men who are most beloved by their institutions are often the most comprehensively destroyed by them. This is exactly why Tunes of Glory is not merely a film about two colonels. It is a film about what happens when a man's entire identity is constituted by an institution that is in the process of making him obsolete. Alfred Hitchcock, whose own relationship to the British film establishment was as complicated and as underexamined as the film's own reception, described Tunes of Glory as one of the finest films ever made. This assessment, documented in the Substack critical essay by Luke Honey, drawing on period sources, did not circulate through the cultural infrastructure in ways that would have materially affected the film's reputation. Hitchcock's name, attached to a British character study about Highland Regiment command hierarchies, did not generate the kind of institutional amplification that the same name attached to a thriller would have produced. The praise was given, it was not received. The film that Hitchcock identified as among the finest of its era spent the following 60 years being described by film historians as an admirable but minor work from a director of the second rank. The gap between the assessment and the reception is its own argument about how cultural institutions decide which works are permitted to be important and which are not. The film's final sequence, Jock Sinclair's breakdown, in which the man who has spent the entire film projecting invulnerability through aggression, charisma, and institutional authority finally disintegrates, wandering the barracks courtyard in his dress uniform, the pipes playing, the institution continuing indifferently around the wreckage of the man who had been its most vivid expression, was assessed by a critic in Sight and Sound as inexcusable, characterized as far less one of tragic remorse than gauchely contrived emotionalism. The assessment is documented in the Wikipedia production, notes, and constitutes the critical establishment's most precise expression of its discomfort with what the film was attempting. The Sight and Sound critic was watching a breakdown and finding it melodramatic. What the film was presenting was a man experiencing the specific psychological consequence of having identified so completely with an institution that its rejection of him constituted the destruction of his entire self. The emotionalism was not gauche. It was accurate. The institution's indifference to individual suffering, the pipes playing on while Jock falls apart, was the film's most honest, formal statement. The critic who found it inexcusable was perhaps finding it too close. The editing of Tunes of Glory was the work of Anne Coates, a figure whose subsequent career trajectory places the film in a specific position in the history of British cinema that has never been adequately acknowledged. 2 years after cutting Tunes of Glory, Coates edited Lawrence of Arabia for David Lean, receiving the Academy Award for Best Film Editing for work that included the most celebrated single cut in cinema history, the match cut from a burning flame to the rising Jordanian sun. Her work on Tunes of Glory represents the major theatrical cut immediately preceding that achievement. A film whose editing required the management of two equally weighted performances in a narrative structured around the gradual inversion of audience sympathy, cutting between two men whose claims on our understanding shift with every scene. The formal intelligence that Lean recognized and trusted in Lawrence was trained, in part, on the Guinness-Mills dynamic that Tunes of Glory required her to calibrate across 106 minutes. Variety called Ronald Neame's direction crisp and vigorous, and acknowledged that John Mills had a tough assignment appearing opposite Guinness in a fundamentally unsympathetic role, an assessment that was technically accurate and critically thin, identifying the film's surface mechanics without engaging with its structural argument. The monthly film bulletin delivered the most specific and the most wrong-headed verdict available, that Neame and Kennaway had thrown away a good idea on an embarrassingly sentimental ending, that false touches and caricature abound, that the film constituted interesting melodrama, but could not honestly be called more. The critics who praised the film's performances, and they were broadly praised, did so in terms that treated the acting as the thing of value and the film as its vehicle, rather than understanding the film as an argument for which the performances were the evidence. Guinness won the Venice Film Festival's Best Actor prize. The prize went to the man. The film it was attached to was treated as his showcase rather than his subject. But the algorithm of history has vindicated Tunes of Glory as something that its critical moment could not accommodate and its marketing had actively prevented. A film whose argument about institutional power and individual destruction is as structurally precise as anything in the British cinema of its era, and whose formal choices, the Technicolor that distorted the critics, the soundstage construction that intensified the claustrophobia, the casting against type that produced two performances of extraordinary complexity, were not accommodations of limitation, but expressions of intelligence. The film that looked like it was trying to be the bridge on the River Kwai and failing was always doing something the bridge on the River Kwai was not interested in attempting, showing what the institution does to the man it has formed when it decides it no longer needs him. Hitchcock's verdict, one of the finest films ever made, was delivered into institutional silence. 60 years of subsequent reappraisal have been building, slowly and without sufficient urgency, toward the same conclusion. James Kennaway died at 40 at the wheel of his car on December 21st, 1968, 8 years after the film that made his name. Having written 6 more novels and watched the only work of his that the culture remembered recede steadily into the kind of respectable obscurity reserved for films that are praised without being examined. He had written, at 28, a novel about two men destroyed by their relationship to an institution that survived them both indifferently. He spent the following 12 years being destroyed, at a slower pace, by his own relationship to the institutions, publishing, Hollywood, marriage, that had formed and would outlast him. Here's the question Tunes of Glory embeds in the sound of pipes playing over a man's disintegration. When an institution, a regiment, a studio, a publishing house, a critical establishment forms a person so completely that they cannot exist outside its validation, and then withdraws that validation, is what follows a tragedy or an inevitability? And is the difference between those two words, the difference between a film that matters and a film that is merely well acted? Leave that in the comments. The argument is the point. If this investigation changed how you see Tunes of Glory, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried secrets that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.